All right, greetings, teachers, students, and the generally curious. Welcome to another episode of The Constitution of American Life with the Friends of Publius. We have coming in from the great state of Indiana, fresh off an amazing win this weekend, the amazing Chris Kavanaugh. We have coming in from Lake Street in Waukesha, Wisconsin. We have Professor Tim Moore, who's licking a few wounds from the first couple games of the NLCS, but we have faith in the Brewers pulling one out today. And we have, in a very dark place, there he is, Professor David Richmond, coming to you from Bakersfield, California. David is very, very happy about the Dodgers 2-0 lead. The Dodgers seem to have found some pitching all of a sudden, so things are looking good in Dodger country. So
all of a sudden, they spent like $700 million to try to get pitching. So I don't know what's all of a sudden there, Professor, but that's okay.
and I'm coming to you from the great University of San Diego here in beautiful San Diego, California. So we are going to just jump right into this date in American history. And I have 3 dates for the Friends of Publius to see which one they think is most important. So on this date, in 1793, Marie Antoinette is executed by guillotine in Paris during the French Revolution. Also on this date, in Germany, Nuremberg, 10 high-ranking Nazi officials are executed following war crimes and convictions. And finally, in 1962, on this date, President John F. Kennedy is informed of Soviet missiles in Cuba, effectively starting the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think I will go in reverse order. I'm going to go to Professor Richmond first and see what you have to say, sir.
On the reverse, okay.
Well,
I'm going to be honest.
fast.
These are, having taught history for 35 years, these are all nice to know. I question whether they're need to know. Probably the Cuban Missile Crisis for a U.S. history class in high school is a need to know. Uh, you know, Maybe they're all on the borderline. Yeah, Marie Antoinette, if you're teaching the French Revolution, that's a nice factoid to have about the death of King Louis and Marie Antoinette. But I'm really trapped because none of these have any relevance today because we've abandoned any lessons that might have been learned from these events. Like Nuremberg, yeah, there's international rules of human rights in the world today. Yeah, people are held accountable. Heck, the United States didn't even sign on to the UN, all right, human rights agreements. Well, we signed on, but we said there's going to be some exceptions, like the International Court of Justice. We don't follow Kennedy and the Soviet missiles. I'll go with that one. All right, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the major one here, just because there's some great movies about it. So that's why I choose the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Marie Antoinette. I think it for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's important. It's significant for American history because I think early '90s, 1790s, America was kind of wrestling with what do we do with this beginnings of the French Revolution? Do we support it? Do we not? So you get and so you get to '93 when she loses her head. I think that turns the tide for some folks in the United States to be more comfortable with British as an ally rather than this alleged connection that we had to the French government because of their assistance in the revolution. So I think that's the first reason I go with Marie Antoinette. And second of all, I mean, generally in history, you don't execute the women. So I think, yikes. So a cautionary tale, ladies. Be careful who you marry and what their political aspirations are. So I'll go with Marie Antoinette.
All right, Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, Marie did not have a choice who she was going to marry. I mean,
Right, true.
she She
Oh
was
yeah, there
married.
is that.
She was married at 14 to cement an alliance between Austria and
Ah, the
France.
good old days.
Yes, yeah, a little too much chlorine in the gene pool and royally in Europe for sure. And poor Louis the 16th was so inept. Oh my goodness. I'm not surprised they executed her though, because they hated her. They called her Madame Deficit. They
Yeah.
said she was a royal thought, THOT,
Hmm.
whatever that meant back in the day. It's not surprising they marched her off, but it also exemplifies the what happens when a revolution turns in on itself,
Hmm.
and the power to too many people or not enough people, and the downside what ends up in the French Revolution. My goodness, uh, the Cuban Missile Crisis I think is important. It's there are clearly lessons to be learned there. What was the other one, Michael? Marie Antoinette.
Nuremberg.
Nuremberg. Yeah. Oh my gosh. How could I? Justice Jackson, one of my favorite justices, sits as one of the judges on that. Um, and I think for me, and I'm agreeing with what David was saying, but also we didn't learn our lesson there, because as we get into Vietnam and we think of Lieutenant Calley and the My Lai massacre and the whole idea we're just following orders, and the defense that was used in Nuremberg by the Nazis, we were just following orders. Um, I think there are lessons in all three of these for where we are right now, in terms of when the mob gets too much power, the French Revolution, and it becomes really bloody, becomes the idea of, oh, well, we were just following orders. This is what our bosses told us to do. So they told us to just round these people up and put them in camps. We're just doing what we were told. That did not turn out to be a defense for those folks at Nuremberg. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, the idea is when we get the ability to destroy the planet, and miscommunication could lead us to real world destruction. I'm going to go with Cuban Missile Crisis just because how close we were to nuclear Armageddon. We really were eyeball to eyeball, as somebody had said during the time, and that Khrushchev blinked. And there were a couple of times during that quarantine. It wasn't a blockade. It was a quarantine of the island of Cuba. Students, this is why words matter. Kennedy did not want to call it a blockade around Cuba because a blockade wouldn't have been a military operation. So we're going to call it a quarantine, which is a much more polite, less threatening word. But we were eyeball to eyeball, and if somebody would have screwed up, it could have been really, really bad. So I'm going to go with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All right. Well, I agree with all of the friends of Publius on this, and I would lean.
Were you running for office?
Yeah, it is. It's also a National Boss Day today, I just learned. So I don't know what that means, but we should all thank our bosses.
Yeah, you're
Well,
you're a
yesterday was
boss.
National Cheese Curd Day, so we have
That's a big
kind
one.
of a statewide holiday. I'm not even sure we
They-
got mail today yesterday.
They're lighting candles for that in Wisconsin, aren't they?
Oh yeah.
I will go with Nuremberg, not because it's obvious that there were lessons were not learned, but I think that it's pretty remarkable in the history of the state and of the nation state. It stands out as a moment of the then superpowers of the world coming together and holding individuals accountable for what they did within their state borders. And maybe it was probably the last time we did that as a collective body on the planet with all of the superpowers doing that. So I'll go with that just for funsies. And now it is National Boss Day, so it's appropriate. I'm turning this over to the boss bus driver.
That is scary. Okay, boss driver, I like that. Thank you, Professor Williams. Again, welcome one and all to the episode 171 of the Constitution in American Life. Before we get going, I have a special announcement. We are taping episodes 13 and 14 the week of October 13th. I would like to invite all teachers and students to participate in the No Kings movement on Saturday, October 18th, a national rally/protest either for America's constitutional system of rule of law and representative government, or against the move into authoritarian government by Trump and his cultists. If you don't agree with my depiction of Trump, just look at our action in the Gulf of Mexico in the past month. The U.S. government is responsible for the murder of 27 individuals without due process of law and in violation of both international and U.S. law. Secondly, hundreds and hundreds of U.S. citizens and legal residents have been rounded up in the past few months in violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments to the Constitution under the pretext of fighting invasion and violence in American cities. Smells of the Palmer raids and McCarthyism all wrapped up in one. So go to nokings.org and to find out the rally nearest you. In a nation of cowards, I hope you have the courage to stand up against tyranny. In this episode of the FOPS, we're going to take a nostalgic look at the Constitution as it used to be. We are going to be discussing the Unit 5 topic from the We the People program, and that is the First Amendment and the public square. No better way to address the rising authoritarianism in America than by looking at how speech, assembly, and association was intended to be protected and how the current administration, along with the assistance of the federal courts, have whittled away at those protections. We also want to look at the emergence of what scholars call the virtual public square and what, if any, regulations can and should be put on modern technological communications. So as we frequently do, let's begin with our own symbol of real America, from the heartland and the great suburb of Milwaukee to Waukesha, Wisconsin, Professor Tim Moore. Tim, the First Amendment literally says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably assemble. What historical understandings and contemporary experiences led the framers to protect these rights?
Well, there's a long historical track record, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Straws on the camel's back here to get us to the First Amendment. I guess one of the first things that I'd like to propose is there's kind of three phases to this. So there's the historical, colonial historical. There's the ratification period, what they were thinking about, what rights were necessary that were needed to be added to the Constitution. And also, I think the first Congress, the first federal Congress has some insight as to what these things, how these evolved and what they meant at the time. Historically, it's interesting that colonial charters and there were speech, press, assembly, and petition show up in those charters quite a bit. And actually, press shows up the most as a right. Speech, a petition is second, and then assembly and then speech follow. So there's a lot of stuff in the colonial era in the charters that mention this freedom as essential. Now, there's also this piece in the colonial period where John Milton writes a piece in 1644, and it's called the Areopagitica. And he makes the argument against the licensure. So already in 1644, there's a Brit, Milton, saying this policy of Parliament actually controlling the licensures of people that could printing presses. Now, in American context, that licensure system never, it wasn't there, and nor is it a part of our constitutional system now. So I think that in 1644, that influences a lot of colonials to view the freedom of the press a certain way. That there should be no parliamentary governmental control, broadly speaking, of those that are allowed to print. During ratification, there's all kinds of attention paid, again, to press as the number one suggestion from the state ratification conventions. We need a Bill of Rights, and press is by far the most mentioned. Speech is second, and petition assembly come in come in a third. So there's a lot of historical background, colonial and revolutionary period. It's interesting to me, the first Congress debates, and as I read through them again this week, again, I was struck by their most of their discussion was what I would call a collective understanding of the purpose of these rights. Meaning, they constantly talk about these rights being tethered to an outcome called the public good. So there's a public nature to these rights. It comes up over and over and over in these deliberations when they talk about how to word these rights, how to phrase these rights. They always have their eye on the public good. There's no notion of private expression. There's always this notion of what I would call a communitarian principle for these rights to exist. It's also interesting to me that there's a lot of discussion. In fact, they go way off the rails about should in the First Amendment, especially in when it comes to assembly and petition, to some degree speech, in instructing representatives, the people have the right to assemble and instruct their representatives. Instruction back in the day is we're going to tell you what to do and go do exactly what we tell you to do. It kind of also kind of overlaps with the theory of representation, but there's a lot of discussion on the let me see, the 15th of August in the first Congress. Do we add that? And I think, in my view, because they're talking about this right of instruction within the First Amendment, it to me demonstrates they're thinking about the public outcome, common good, not personal expression in the first Congress as they talk about these rights in the First Amendment.
So these rights eventually evolved into this term or concept, freedom of expression and expressive conduct. I'm just wondering, do you see that language as being consistent with the original language of the First Amendment?
No, I don't, but it also might not matter.
Good
I
point.
think as I kind of did a quick kind of a global survey, it seems to me in the 60s, 1960s and 70s, we really start to broaden out the First Amendment to be more personal expression type approaches. I mean, when I looked at the case history, it seems like the 60s and 70s really, that's that punctuated decade or so where expression comes into the way we understand the First Amendment. That's how I would see it anyway.
Well, does anybody know when does expression become the language of the First Amendment clauses? When is that first introduced? I'm just wondering if anybody, and again, that's an unfair question possibly, because I'm sure none of you keep that at the top of your brain power there. But I just
That's a
wonder if
need to
anybody
know.
knew.
That's a need to know.
Is that a need to know or a nice to know, nuts to know? Anyway, Chris, you want to jump in?
Well, I was just not with the when did we get freedom of expression? I'm not sure, but actually, I was thinking, and I just now thought of this listening to Tim. For the students, there are definitely some the lineage of these ideas go way back, not only to like John Milton. I'm thinking like of Trenchard and Gordon and Cato's letters. There some, I'm almost going to bust out the word wig, so I'm going to have to maybe take a drink here of my tea. How appropriate. That they're writing about free speech quite a bit. I'm thinking about Spinoza, basically a philosopher that's kind of lost in this time frame, who was a Jewish rabbi, sort of. Not, I don't know, he's an interesting cat, but Spinoza's talking about free speech. So we're this whole idea of freedom. I don't know if it's expression, but freedom of speech goes really far back. And in terms of press, we've mentioned this before on the program. They debated at the convention whether or not they should put freedom of the press in the body of the Constitution. That was one right they really debated about. And their argument was, if we say that it's protected, are we assuming that we have the power to limit it? So they just stayed away from it during the constitutional debate. So freedom of the press was a hugely important one in the colonial period.
Well, you bring up Spinoza, and I guess that's always been my question: is to what degree does theory and philosophy affect the Americans, the colonial thinkers, versus experiential, their experiences. So you seem to say that there is some theory and philosophy that impacts them, where I've always understood it's really experiential.
Well, we just got done talking about we've talked about this before about the evolutionary nature of the American Revolution versus is it revolutionary or evolutionary? And I think to steal from Tim, that bottom up kind of idea of folks on the ground, that's a revolutionary idea. For the educated people of the time, it's going to be more evolutionary, especially coming out of the period of salutary neglect. And I think, David, not necessarily with free speech and free press, but I would go right to the idea of writs of assistance and general warrants. When James Otis is arguing against that in 1763 in Boston, he's going all the way back to Sir Edward Coke, the Five Knights cases, the rights of Englishmen. So it's very much a theory about their rights as Englishmen. So it's maybe he's arguing about theory and law from their British past and talking about what's happening right then and on the ground in Boston. So I think that may be a better example of the evolutionary nature of this thought process with the actual actions of the crown and how colonists respond to that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So back to you, Professor Kavanaugh. A general standard when dealing with the First Amendment speech rights is the principle of time, place, and manner restrictions. Could you explain in general how this standard works in the real world? And then I've got a follow up to that. So just if
Well,
you could do a general, yeah, good luck.
in the real world,
In the real world, because again, we talk about theory or general principle all the time, but we all know that when that gets to the road meets that kind of whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure
that
that your average police officer that is charged with keeping the public, is calm and quiet and safe, understands all the nuances of legal theory. But for basically, there are four things to really think about when you think about time, place, and manner restrictions, or TPM, as the nerdy people call it, right? First of all, it has to be content neutral. So when we're talking about when the time, place, and manner, to go back up for a second, is we're really talking about when the government can restrict speech or expression, right? So one of the things they have to really think about is it content neutral? The regulation cannot favor or disfavor a viewpoint, right? There can't be viewpoint discrimination. Does it serve a significant government interest? If they're going to limit it, the restriction must be in place to address a legitimate public concern, safety, traffic control, protecting private property kind of thing, residential property. So is there a significant government interest? Is it narrowly tailored? That's something else to consider about. Is it focused on achieving the government's interest without necessarily limiting speech or expression? Because if you give the government overly broad power, they will use it. So is that time, place, and manner restriction narrowly tailored? And the fourth one, are there alternate channels for communication? The government regulation limiting, it's got to open other meaningful opportunities for people to express their message. So those are the four kind of things the government has to consider before they come in to start limiting speech or expression in terms of time, place, and manner restriction. They also have to consider where. Like, are there traditional public forums, or the designated public forums, or there non-public forums, or as we see right now, free speech zones, right? If we look at around the country now and some of the protests against some of the activities that's taken place, especially around ICE facilities, they're designated free speech zones, which is kind of weird to think that there are certain places you can go and exercise your rights, but once you cross a line, you can't exercise your rights. It was just kind of wacky.
So a couple of, I guess, not case studies or just situational things I'd like you to maybe provide some insight on. Schools are public spaces. They're publicly owned and operated. So to what extent can speech be limited on school grounds if they're public spaces?
Well, the courts kind of ruled that, going back to the idea that they don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and expression, going back to Tinker. And as Tim has always pointed out, there's a big but in there. And again, I want to go back.
Big but. Big but.
Yeah. However, when that speech is interfering with the educational process and the school has the ability to regulate it, therefore, the hands, administrators get to decide what's interfering with the educational process, or I think it was called substantial disruption is the official terminology. So it's a kind of a toss up on school grounds, honestly, these days. I think about the Bong Hits for Jesus, Morris v. Frederick case. For those students, if you want to listen to an oral argument, it's kind of funny if you listen to that case and listen to the justices talking about bong hits. It's pretty funny. Whenever the late great RBG is talking about hitting that bong. So, yeah, sorry, but it's interesting because this kid holds his banner up across the street from the school. It says "Bong Hits for Jesus" as the Olympic torch is coming by, and the assistant principal sees it and obviously flips out. She doesn't read the whole thing. She sees bong hits, and that's as far as she gets. So it's more what she saw and how she interpreted the banner than really what was on the banner, and the authority given to schools then to regulate that type of speech. And we know that, anything that's supporting drug and alcohol use, like bong hits, even if it's like get high with Jesus, get high on Jesus. I'm not sure where the kid was going with that, other than trying to get his face on television. So they're able to limit these types of expressions. So it's kind of honestly, Dave, with schools, it's a mixed bag. It's interesting though, because members of the public, including parents, generally don't have the same speech rights on school property as students do.
Theoretically, yeah, it's true.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah. So would you say it's squishy?
It's definitely squishy.
Tim, let's add on to the squishiness here.
Well, no, I just have a question. I vaguely remember from years back that there's a whole set of jurisprudence called the public forum doctrine, and there's almost like there's public forums, but then there's like level 1, level 2, level 3, and am I remembering that right? That there's this public forum doctrine might be relevant to sort that in addition to the time, place, manner issues.
Right. I think Chris kind of touched a little bit on that. Can you kind of bring some more light to that, Chris, as far as it's 4 levels, right? Is it 4 levels of public forum doctrine?
Well, I'm not sure about the levels, but partly it depends on
not levels, categories is probably a better term, I guess.
Yeah, well, you have privately owned spaces, you have public versus private entities. So
but there's like public entities or public. I don't know, Mike. Have you got?
Yeah, it's not the entities. I think Chris has touched on. It's the space. So a sidewalk is a traditional public space when you think of like a town square, right? And then there are designated public spaces, and that's where I think we're talking like what they're doing with ICE. They're saying, look, we're going to give you some space around ICE where you can, as a designated. Then there are limited public spaces, which is actually what the court has said schools are. So you don't have as much right, you don't have as much freedom of speech protections in a school as you do on a street corner. And then there are non-public forums, and let me just look this up really quick. Military bases, jails, airport terminals, that's where your rights are at their least, right? Where you have the least amount of First Amendment rights. Now, in all those cases, to Chris's point, if the government wants, like in the government, the airport, it's a whole bunch of time, place, and manner restrictions, right? And they actually, and the government could claim, okay, we want to do some content-based restrictions. For example, you are not allowed to make a joke about a bomb. That's content-based, right? And the way the government would argue that it's okay to do that in an airport is to say, well, we have a compelling state interest to not freak TSA people out by jokes about bombs. So it's not that the government can't pass these laws; they can pass them, but they have to make different sets of arguments. And that depends on the space it's in, and it depends on whether the regulations are content neutral or content based. So there's all these different sort of hoops to go through.
And you know, that whole idea, it goes back to what I said about serving a significant government interest, public safety. So there, obviously, you know,
Right.
that would be a limit. And I think there are three things, three levels, Tim, that Mike said, and you know, traditional public forums, designated public forums, and non-public forums. But it's interesting for the non-public forums, classrooms fall within that. School classrooms fall within that non-public forum.
Hmm.
So one more little situational thing here, Chris, because it's always kind of, I don't know, it's been fuzzy to me or squishy, however we want to define it. So public places, or excuse me, places that are open to the public and encourage public participation, but privately owned, are those areas in which the First Amendment rights are protected? Like, again, outside the Costco or the Walmart. Walmart serves the public, all right, doesn't discriminate. In fact, they can't discriminate. So, to what degree are First Amendment rights protected both inside and outside Walmart?
Well, this is still private property. So they have the ability on private property to limit your speech. So if you're out there carrying a sign in front of Walmart and saying Walmart shafts its workers by not paying, you know, or not giving them health care, they can have me removed because it is private property. It's kind of like one of my favorites, since we're all baseball guys, I think one of my favorites is when the Boston Red Sox fan shows up at Yankee Stadium with a t-shirt on that says F the Yankees. And can they, since the Yankee Stadium's a private entity, can they ask that guy to remove his shirt or give him something else? And the answer is yes, because, well, we know how.
Well, the Yankees are fascist. We know that.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but that whole idea of that private property. So yeah, Costco, Walmart, Yankee Stadium, it is private property. Now, do they want to get wrapped up in that? Traditionally not. Traditionally not. But if they're going to stop a brawl from happening in the, you know, short porch in right field, they're definitely going to ask the Boston Red Sox fan to cover up his shirt or give him maybe some Yankee stuff to put on.
Yeah, there's and again, I know this is the issue with Unit 5. There are so many, we can go down so many paths. What if, and we all face it as teachers, what about? I have a cousin who, you know.
Yeah, we sound like Stephen Breyer in our hypotheticals.
Yeah. So, Tim, I'm curious, could you identify and briefly describe maybe one or two, because, and I guess I should provide some context here. I've always questioned whether or not the First Amendment truly has that much value when it comes to political or social movements. So could you provide maybe one or two examples where you think the First Amendment had significant, tremendous, however you want to describe it, value in helping that movement move forward?
Well, success, I'll start out by caveating how we're defining success. Primarily in terms of time frame. I think there are plenty, personally, I think there are plenty of examples where the First Amendment has been used successfully, and it took a while. So in America, because we're not particularly a revolutionary people to this point, I mean, we have these punctuated moments, but generally our rattle and hum moments are kind of spread out. So success, I think the anti-war movement in the 60s could fit that category, largely because it happened fairly quickly compared to like the abolitionist movement. That was a long, long trail with abolitionism or the civil rights movement or women's suffrage. There's a long march as well. So I think the 60s, and I think it's successful because it's more than just political speech. I mean, I remember seeing years ago this thing on the 60s, and there was a group of all people, like they called themselves kind of anarchist theater people, the diggers. They copped their name
Wait,
from
isn't that every day at the University of Wisconsin?
well, it kind of yes, but I guess my point about the anti-war movement in the '60s is it was certainly political demonstrations, but also there was absurdist theater that got in the underground comedy newspapers. Comedy was used as a form of protest. So I think. I guess I would say that the success of the '60s anti-war movement was because it just didn't limit itself to political speech. It was much more broad. And I think that's an example. I think another one is the relatively quick uh, use of the First Amendment in terms of environmentalism. I think the largest single day gathering of protest was in the '70s on environmentalist issues, and we got we if you want to say success comes through the creation of the EPA and other environmental regulations. I think that's fairly quick. But in general, I think there's a long arc, to borrow a phrase from our history. There's a long arc that usually has to occur before change can occur through First Amendment.
That was excellent. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, we talk about the attention economy right now, and we focus on like social media. But back on the days before we had the internet and stuff, like to get attention, you did it in a public space. That's where the news media would come, and that's where you could have your moment to get all over the airways. So I think there's something to it. May not be as appropriate now or as relevant now, but David, given your comments at the beginning about the No Kings rally, I mean, that's what they are counting on, this fact of using public spaces to get news media attention, to then the goal is to switch public opinion. So I think if you imagine societies where they're just that right does not exist, right? Like Putin's Russia today or North Korea, it makes social movements. It's one more huge obstacle for a social movement to get through. They can't mobilize people because they're not out in public doing it. And so
I want to commend you, Tim. I had not thought about Earth Day. And then it's the passage of the Environmental Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, all the things that follow. So I thought that was an excellent example. And I never thought I'd see the day where a former student of mine uses the term, well, back in the day, man, I'm old. It's time to put me out and take me out to the backfields and shoot me in the head. Anyway, so Mike,
Chris?
yeah, Chris.
I'm sorry. Just one other thing too, to kind of rain on the parade a little bit.
Uh-oh.
Well, Tim mentioned the civil rights movement, and what we end up getting is the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and now we see that being dismantled. Right? There was a case that was heard this past week out of Louisiana, and could strike down the very last section of the Voting Rights Act because evidently there's a time frame on racism, according to Justice Kavanaugh, not spelled the same way, even though I do like beer. So it's a little bit of a frustration that people use those First Amendment rights to march, to protest, to get knocked down by fire hoses and bitten by police dogs, and we bring about change by getting legislation, but now some of that legislation is being dismantled. So frustration.
So, Mike, let's shift direction a little bit here. I would argue, and I'll be honest, I've read a number of things that support this argument, that the internet created a virtual public square that presents complex challenges to the courts on regulating speech. How should the public square, in your opinion, be treated by courts and law? And I have an example I want to throw at you after that. So just in general, do you agree with it that there's a virtual public square? And I'm wondering, how should that be regulated, if at all?
Yeah. So let me see if it's a great question. And this is the virtual public square language is not like a Supreme Court finding, right? Kennedy has said in this decision, Packingham 2017, he talked about social media as the modern public square, but he's gotten pushback that it was dicta and that they don't want to be bound by that. Because students, this is where you can kind of, for me, these types of questions, you have to kind of slow down your mind and maybe diagram this out. As we've already mentioned, private entities can do what they want, right? For the most part, right? Costco, Target, Instagram, Twitter, they can make up their rules on content moderation, and they could kick people on or off their property based on violating our First Amendment rights. So the move here is, are these social media spaces, are they not just private anymore? Because if you see them as public, the move you're making there constitutionally in terms of your analysis is that, well, if you see these as virtual public spaces, then you're ascribing to them some state action or some state purpose, by which now if Instagram says to their users, or then if they are that, then how do I say this? Then for Instagram to say we want to moderate, they are now going to face a constitutional challenge in a way that they're not now. It would also open the door up to the government saying these are public spaces, so now we can act in a content neutral way, and now we can get in the game when they can't get into the game if these are simply private entities. So the courts have had a hard time with this, right? I mean, because they're not being directed by any sort of congressional legislation on what to do. So you have states doing different things. The state of North Carolina, this Packingham case from 2017, the state of North Carolina passed a law trying to limit a registered sex offender's access to certain websites where they said they were going to be minors. The court, in a unanimous decision, struck down the law as being overly broad, that they swept, that you can't tell an individual can't be stopped by the state to go into a certain website. And now states are just dealing with that case and trying to figure out their own fact patterns. So I don't think the courts have found a way to deal with it. This is kind of like the Wild West out there in terms of how do we fit this in to our existing doctrine. And I can say it's what's going to make it really difficult is this idea that the First Amendment doesn't apply to private action. It only applies to congressional action. And the fact that the kind of content that I think most of us would think about trying to limit maybe in some of these spaces, if we're in a public forum, is going to be speech related to content or maybe hate speech. And the court's been very clear that hate speech regulations are not constitutional. So I think it's going to be a tricky move for the courts to navigate this.
Well, here's, I guess, the question, and I don't know if it's on the minds of this generation of students, because television is really not part of their lives, it seems, other than streaming and that kind of stuff. But there's the FCC and television in our age, back in the 70s, 80s, the FCC had the power to regulate and control First Amendment expression. How is Facebook, those things, how is that any different because of the impact, the scope of which they have that impact?
Yeah.
How is that any different than television in our age?
Yeah, maybe, and Tim and Chris, please step into this if I'm not leading the students down the right path on this. It didn't have to do with the impact. It had to do with that the government said access to the public airways are public. So if you private entities are going to get access to our government space, we can now regulate you. So the move would be, and again, I don't want to go too far into the students because I haven't done my homework on this. If the government claimed through a law that the space that is being used for us to transmit our messages, digital, right? Then they would be in that arena to say now we can regulate it. And I'm just not sure. I think maybe the more appropriate, like public utilities can be regulated. I'm not like old-fashioned telephones. So this is a question of the move of passing a law, making that claim, and then seeing, then it would have to get tested, whether the courts are going to say, is this something that passes muster? Can the government claim that this is somehow public? So
Well, and Congress at some point said that they own, that is the U.S. government, the airwaves. So
yeah,
why can't Congress declare that they own the digital sphere, whatever that is?
yeah.
Okay, because I don't understand how
I
Congress
don't,
can claim they own the airwaves and then somehow they're prohibited from,
yeah,
controlling or influencing or regulating the digital universe.
I don't recall the debates, but I think for students, this is a great thing for you to do a little research on. What were those arguments made, and can you make an analogous argument today? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I'd like students to do, Chris.
Well, what's this Congress you mentioned, David? What is this Congress? I'm not familiar, but
Well,
anyway,
Congress passed the
I'm
FCC.
David. I was joking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're doing your shtick on is do we have a Congress? Okay, I got it.
Yeah, well, it's not a shtick. It's a legitimate question because anyway, we really
Well, we
don't.
know half of them are still out of
Yeah.
town. So yeah.
Anyway, I think we need to go. We've mentioned this before. Is Section 230 of the whatever the what decency? I don't know, some broadcast decency act or something like that. But students, look up Section 230 and what that allows these online platforms, whether it be Facebook or Instagram, whatever. It allows them to just simply say we're a platform and we're going to have our own rules and regulations, and we're not going to take responsibility for disinformation or misinformation. We're going to have our own standards. We're going to regulate, trust us to regulate our platforms. So that I think is something that could be fixed if we think about holding those platforms accountable for misinformation, disinformation. Um,
So yeah, exactly. So it seems to me, Chris, that Section 230 and the language of it implies that Congress has jurisdiction. If they can pass this law to say the language of that 230 says, they could change the language and say we have the authority to regulate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chris or Mike?
I mean, it would be like, are you thinking, Chris, it would be like under the Commerce Clause and Commerce Clause combined with necessary and proper? Yeah, sure. David, can I bring up one other concept for the students?
Of course you can.
It's a term called job owning that the students should be aware of. And this is the idea. We've just seen this happen with Jimmy Kimmel, right? It's where if a regulator, if an FCC regulator says something to a private entity and says, you know what, you really should moderate some of the speech on your airways or else. The court has been really, really clear that making that sort of threat is a First Amendment violation. That person acting as the state official there, pressuring a private entity to moderate speech is something that the court's been pretty clear that that is not going to happen. So, for example, if a government official were to say something to like Twitter or X, right, you better make sure you have X and X content, or else we may not approve some license or whatever. That's something that is not allowed under the First Amendment when that state official acts like that.
Well, and that leads to my question about, so hypothetical should, well, I don't know if it's really that hypothetical these days. Should my employer be able to fire me, Mike, for speech expressed on my social media platforms outside of the workplace, outside of the work day?
I don't know if they should be able to. The most of our jobs in this economy are at will. And so our employers, in most cases, depending on our job, can fire us as long as they're not doing it like in terms of unfair, discriminatory reasons. So that's where the law is on it. That yes, your employer, depending on your job now, right? Your employer could fire you for something you said in your own time off the side. If you work for the government, then you have more rights. So all of us, I don't work at a state institution, but any of you working as teachers out there, then you have your school has less freedom to fire you for what you say because you are a government employee. But yeah, you can get fired. Sorry.
Tim?
I've been ruminating here on this. Is the internet a public square, or the new public square? Let's assume that it is. which, by the way, you can tell I don't believe it is. But let's assume for a minute that it is. I'm willing, if it is, it's a pretty thin, poor excuse for one. Because it seems to be like Mike said this earlier, back in the day, I'm old, I can say that. It took a heck of a lot of effort to connect and go down to the town square or Memorial Plaza, or there was a lot of organizational tactics that had to occur for there to be a public demonstration in a public square. The ease of which you can enter the digital public space, I'm not convinced that that's real connectivity within that, if it is a public square. And if it is, it's pretty thin and therefore I would say arguably very ineffective. To me, this whole thing with no kings, I think proves this. We can rail all we want on X, but at some point somebody decided maybe we ought to get together on the library lawn, an actual physical place in town. I mean, that's where it'll be here in Waukesha. So I think the fact that that even in a digital world, people still think real places matter in addition to, or sometimes in some cases, in place of digital spaces.
It seems the thinness here is in your distinction between virtual.
It might be.
Well, between virtual and face to face. Maybe because virtual doesn't have the same feeling or impact, it therefore diminishes the role that government can play.
Well, I think there's less risk. I think there's less risk. And I do think there's this idea that there's this performative protest, which I think the digital space encourages, that it's all performance and there's not much there.
And I won't disagree with you on that, Tim, but to say there's less risk, I think you need to talk to the hundreds of people who've been fired for their expression, whether in they're employed by the government. In fact, how many teachers, Mike? You say teachers are protected. It all depends on their collective bargaining agreement.
No. I just said they have more protections. I didn't say they were completely protected. No.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood on that. I think there's a risk. There's clearly a risk to.
Well, I personally have some experience with that risk issue too in digital
I know you
spaces.
do.
So that's why I'm just speculating about this argument that it's an equivalent to a public space. That's all. I'm just wondering about that, and I got some questions about it.
And it's a good point. It's a good point. So, Professor Kavanaugh, numerous experts on the First Amendment law have argued that the Trump administration is attempting to diminish freedom of expression in the public square, i.e., if we can look at Portland and Chicago, and we're talking about those who are protesting, all right, the government actions vis-a-vis, I don't know, radicalism and immigration. I don't exactly know what the government presence is all about there. And universities by putting certain requirements on hiring, admissions, and curriculum, as well as creating a litmus test for speech on college campuses. Do you agree with these people who are saying the Trump administration is posing a great threat across the spectrum to the First Amendment?
Yes.
And expand on that. Why do you agree with me?
Well, because of all those things you just said. When you start to limit, because I understand the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. So we know that Congress or the government, right, as Mike was alluding to in some of what he was talking about earlier about private actors or non-state actors versus state actors. So when the chairman of the FCC says we can do it the hard way or the easy way, that's definitely a restriction, right? Talking about Jimmy Kimmel and other people getting their licenses and controlling what's on there. I'll share a piece from Politico where a judge excoriates the Trump administration. And this was a judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, Judge Young, in a case where foreign exchange students were deported simply because of their speech. One of the reasons I'm wearing my Indiana sweatshirt this evening, in addition to the fact that we are now the #3 football team in the country, Oregon, got to get that shout out, is because I'm a journalism grad Go ahead. Yeah, it's great, Tim. I'm happy for you.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, I don't think we have a football team right now, but
Is Barry Alvarez still around? Is he still
Wow,
there?
wow, wow.
Anyway, um, I have an undergraduate degree from IU in journalism, and I spent some time in Ernie Pyle Hall, which is the journalism, the J building. And now, thanks to the government in the state of Indiana, my home state, and the IDS, the Indiana Daily Student, is no longer publishing on a daily basis because you have new trustees put in by the governor, who is a staunch supporter of President Trump. And you're taking one of the most prestigious daily college newspapers and no longer is being printed. So it's like, of course, this is a chilling, hugely chilling effect on free speech rights around the country. Universities being this new extortion plan, you agree with, if you have to agree to do what we want to get the funding. It is just, it's being run like a mafioso, where you're paying the protection, money so your place doesn't burn down. So absolutely, I would agree with people in talking about the Trump administration and their actions limiting the First Amendment practices of free speech.
it strikes me as kind of a roundabout way to do prior restraint. The
Mm.
very things that Milton and others in England were arguing against in many ways.
That's that term chilling effect, right? When you start to see other people, that Japanese one bullet theory of motivation, you just shoot one prisoner in the Bataan Death March and you get everybody to behave. So when you crack down on a school or a network or something else, that has an incredibly chilling effect, or prior restraint, as Tim just said.
So I'm curious, Tim and Mike, you both work at universities. Have you seen any impact? I mean, neither one of your universities, to my knowledge, are in the news, but have you seen any impact psychologically or, physically on the attitudes, behaviors of university staff and students because of what's been happening the last number of months? I'm just curious.
Well, Wisconsin, there's always festivities out on the Memorial Plaza. Um, I wasn't around UW-Madison in the 60s and early 70s, so we don't have any bombings of Sterling Hall equivalents right now. But I mean, there's still a lot of rattle and hum. Now, I don't know how it compares really. I do know that faculty are quite nervous. Um, yeah, so I know there might be a difference between the faculty and student bodies on this too. I don't know.
Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the students, I'm not getting a lot from the students, to be honest. I do know that we've had on this campus for 15 years now. Every campus has to get an accreditation from a regional place, right? And one of our things 15 years ago is that we had to do more to be more inclusive of non-white students. So we created a center, and the center was Center for Inclusion and Diversity. That center has been renamed the Center for Cultural Development. I think to stay out of the crosshairs. I'm in the very beginning stages of a faculty hire, and we've been given instructions from the administration on we need to articulate to all applicants that if they are going to use if they have to have a visa, that that it's going to be difficult for us to make that happen because
Wow.
the $100,000 thing. Now there are some exceptions to that and stuff, but the point is that yeah, it's changed some of the things that I've come across as a faculty member. Yeah.
I would assume you had a certain number of, or I don't know how significant, 5-10% of your students were international.
Yeah. We've had students who've been unable to come back for their studies. We have about 10% international students. We have a master's program in my department. I just heard at a department meeting today that two folks who are supposed to come in the spring from, I believe it's Italy, have now said that they're not able to come because of visa issues. So, yeah, I mean, we are feeling it like every other place in higher ed at that level.
Chris?
So think about this for students. When the president of the United States is calling members of the press scum, when he's calling the press enemy of the people or fake news, think about what the Pentagon, just this in the last few days, what the Pentagon is trying to do to allow coverage, right? And you have to sign off on this document that you're not going to publish even things that are unclassified. So, my goodness, you even have some right-wing media not going along with this. So they're trying to limit that flow of information. You get the idea of security clearances for lawyers and firms. So these big law firms, if they ever want to work and represent anybody in government, they have to, that chilling effect there. Using the FCC to launch investigations on media outlets. We talk about CBS and Jimmy Kimmel. Think about this, NPR, PBS. My goodness, they're not funding Big Bird now or National Public Radio. So, I mean, it's weaponizing libel law. So, yes, that there are so many specific examples of the current administration trying to limit First Amendment rights. So, just a few more.
So, Professor Williams, I was looking at some international data, and it seems to me that if you ask the typical American, Tim Moore, no, he's not typical. Tim is atypical American. Not atypical, but atypical. If you ask a typical American on the streets of any town or city, if the U.S. has the greatest amount of freedom of expression, they would strongly agree. That's what the data I found suggested. In your view, does the United States have greater or lesser protection of free speech relative to similar kind of nations around the world? And I'll follow up with that as you address that question.
It depends on how you frame it. In one sense, yes, right? In one sense, yes. And that is most other advanced countries, advanced democratic countries, they don't have a regulation where we say the government just can't limit hate speech. There's some hate speech regulation in most countries. In all of Europe, there are much stricter online laws in terms of regulating online platforms. And in most other countries, there's more regulation of private entities. It's easier to get at private. I mean, heck, South Africa has this clause in their constitution where basic rights can be applied horizontally. So it's like citizen to citizen, they can take a look to make sure that your rights aren't being violated. So in terms of the constitutional doctrine, in terms of what we've been talking about, yeah, Americans we're not regulated by hate speech. Our online usage isn't being regulated at all. Now, so that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is as a constitution of negative rights, it's set up like I have as much right of a freedom of expression as any other person. With the vast, I would argue, wealth inequalities and with a monopoly over media, do I in practice actually have as much free expression rights as I like to think I have? Probably not. I couldn't find any good comparisons with that sort of thing, unless we were to get some survey data on some subjective, like what people think. But yeah, legally, constitutionally, we do. And what's ironic to me about this is like, given how Tim started this discussion about what, for what it was worth, what the founders had in mind, that it was about public discussion, right? It had this like civic virtuous kind of thing to it, right? That we have now, through case law and through, I think, cultural changes, we now see it as expression. It's so much more than what the founders thought it should be. And in some ways, that's made it harder for the government to now limit it, right? If we get at a spot where we want to limit something because it's not good for the public health, not health, like, you know what I mean? Like it's not good for our organic community to have certain types of things being said. Our government's much less able to regulate that than other places in the world. And I think a lot of Americans would probably just say that's the way it should be. That's great. Like, let all the ideas out there. I'm a big First Amendment guy, huge, So it's hard for me to think of like what that office is going to look like to regulate some of this stuff. But sometimes I just think if we just went back to what the founders had in mind, right, we'd have much different sorts of boundaries on this.
Well, I am curious, and this probably goes to you and Tim and all of you. You seem to imply that the economic structure of America, the concentration of wealth, the power of wealth in the agencies of communication diminishes free speech, possibly without maybe any empirical data, to a greater degree than it does in other countries. Wasn't that the case in the 18th century? That when we look at media in the 18th century, it was concentrated, the publishers, into certain, hands, and therefore speech was heavily regulated depending upon where you lived. Tim, Chris?
There, well, the media is newspapers, and there was no licensure. So I think, um, yeah, I would push back on that in the
Okay,
18th
yeah.
century as it relates to newspapers.
Chris, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I was thinking of what Michael was saying. Something triggered me when he talked about the organic health of a community, and back to the economic nature of things too, because whether it's thick or thin in terms of these connections in this virtual civic square, public square, it is the mass form of communication today, using online programs. And I'm thinking about, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm thinking like under the Biden administration during COVID, when the Biden administration was asking online platforms, whether it be X or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, to try and do some moderation on misinformation. So it wasn't just organic health; it was actually the real health during a pandemic. They killed thousands of Americans, millions of Americans actually. So they're actually asking these platforms to, could you regulate this misinformation that you're allowing? And then people say, well, wait a minute, that is a violation of the First Amendment. This is the government, putting their thumb on the scale and trying to limit these entities from, free speech kind of thing. And yet now you see Google and Apple have removed apps that this current administration has asked them to remove, that people use to share information about tracking ICE agents, because they're talking again back to the very beginning. We're talking about health or the safety, right? Public safety. Their argument is these apps allow people to know in their community where ICE agents are, which will prohibit them from doing their jobs. And so Google and Apple have both agreed to take the apps off of their platforms. They won't platform the apps that people are using anymore. So we go from the Biden administration asking these apps to be socially aware, socially conscious about things, to now controlling these other entities. And part of that is just the economics of it. They don't want to get crossways with the administration. And I mean, I think the other thing too is like, we're expecting these billionaires that own these platforms to be civically virtuous. We expect them to have going back to the founding, we expect them to be virtuous. And there's no virtue in what they're trying to do. They're trying to make, I shouldn't say that, not no virtue, but their concern are shareholders. Their concern is the bottom line. Their concern is not the damage that they might be able to do to our society by not regulating their platforms. Their concern is the idea of making money. So the virtue, that idea of virtue flies out the window.
Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of this topic and our discussion, and so it's now time for you to share your final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers as they deal with Unit 5 question here on freedom of speech. So, Professor Williams.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty, in some ways, straightforward question. You're going to have to show that you understand these different restrictions and get your way around the First Amendment, all that kind of stuff. I'd be curious, given that that you students are so much more part of this online culture than I am. I'd be interested in hearing, I don't know if in your opening statement or at least in the question answer, be ready to talk about is this virtual space, is it a public space? And what would that mean? And if there are there good reasons why the government might want to start regulating this? There's lots of evidence out there about what it's doing to young people, what it's doing for mental health. And is there a public health reason, right, that something should be? I don't know. I'd just be curious, given that you're in it more than we are, or at least I am. I'm interested in your insights on that. So I would be,
Oh,
I would
I'm
talk.
all over X. I'm all over Instagram. I love TikTok.
I've seen your TikTok, and it's quite good. It's good.
Okay, there's a lot of,
Just like under,
sarcasm going
just
on
like
there.
under, like
'Cause
under,
I didn't know
under
Professor
the
Moore had a
Shaw.
TikTok.
Oh, he does
Uh,
now. It's called the Shaw.
The Shaw, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Anyway, sorry, Mike.
No, I'm done.
All right, Professor Moore.
Yeah, I kind of like these discussions about the legal units because I have very little relevance in them. But as I've been listening to all of this, I guess I would urge students, because you're going to be arguing with all these hypotheticals. I think it came up earlier in our discussion. You're going to get judges ask you, well, what about, let me give you a situation. I would urge you in your discussions amongst your unit is to think about, okay, how would we read the First Amendment from a libertarian perspective? And how would we read the First Amendment from a communitarian perspective? Now, I think the libertarian, I think we've generally gone down the trail of a libertarian reading of the First Amendment. But all I'm suggesting is it might be interesting for you to talk with your unit mates here in Unit 5. What would the First Amendment look like if we read it communitarian versus this wide open, Wild West libertarian view of the First Amendment? So I think that might be some interesting discussions.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, I'm going to steal from Aldous Huxley and say that we're in a brave new world here, I think, in terms of the internet. Well, and the internet is not new, but students are watching this. You guys, you have never known the world without it, right? And if you think about going all the way back to, say, the printing press and Gutenberg and the Bible, right? Or 95 Theses on the Door, and that gets circulated. And you think about as technology changes and how that technology has allowed mass communication, but nothing like we enjoy today. I can hit a button on my computer and a message can be around the world. So you guys are dealing with some old ideas and theory in a much different world than, say, Spinoza, who I mentioned earlier, or Trenchard and Gordon, or John Milton. It's way different. And also, there's also the financial matter that it has when you have these billionaires have their own platforms now, and they can control. They are the gatekeepers. So that's a whole nother issue as well. Something I want students to think about. You guys live in this TikTok world, like Mr. Moore. What world do you want your children to live in? So as you fast forward far into the future, when some of the students that are listening to this will be parents, what type of online or digital world do you want your kids to be immersed in? And what role should the government play in regulating that online world? Because we're going to protect our kids like crazy when they go out into the real world because we're so fearful, but we don't do much to protect them online. So what would you, if you put yourself in the role of a parent, what would you like to see the online or digital world look like in relationship to government control?
Very good, gentlemen. Just to add to what they've all said, the foundations of American democracy rely upon access to information by the public, in the public sphere, access to accurate information, and communication from our representatives. And so there has been a number of columns written recently that American style democracy and possibly any style of democracy cannot survive in the age of social media, in which fake news, misinformation, disinformation can circumnavigate the globe, all right, 10 times before the truth can even get out in your local community. And, so I would look into that is can we sustain democratic government when we don't have any kind of sense of shared facts, shared information, and shared communication from our government? Something to think about. So in our next episode, when we meet with Unit 1, we'll be talking about colonial governments and classical republicanism and human nature. Until then, peace, love, yoga tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.